Okay, so decided to do one more video before I call it a day. It's now 11:28 p.m. from where I am, and right. So maybe the last target I'd like to do for the day is to be able to integrate a T account entry in the system. And basically, what a T account is, according to Investopedia, is that it's a record, a financial record that uses double entry for bookkeeping. So the idea here is that if you make a transaction, you need to record that transaction in the accounting system according to the amount, of course, of that transaction. But more importantly, the accounting the accounts where the amount of the transaction would fall under. So an example here would be that if a company, for example, Barnes and Noble, sold $20,000 worth of books, it will debit its cash account, which is our accounting code from our chart of accounts for 20,000, and it will credit inventory since it reduced the inventory, which is a type of asset. So for assets, if you credit a particular account, then you're essentially applying a negative value against that particular account. So we debit cash because we add to the asset cash, and at the same time we credit inventory because we remove 20,000 from inventory worth of books. So this double entry is an example of a T account, and the basic principle is that for the T account, you can have multiple debit and credit records for a single transaction, but the debit side should always be balanced with the credit side. At least that's the way I would understand how T accounts are recorded. So we'd like to model this using what we already have. And right, so just to clear things up, okay, let's try to model it first. So we already have accounting codes, and let's say that for today we have a date January 5, 2020. Let's say we have a particular, just some text that describes what the transaction, the type of transaction that actually occurred. So for example, let's say I bought something from a store. Let's say for food, right? Food and drinks. So the particular would be probably something like buy food and drinks. Okay, it's just text. And I'd like to have for this transaction record a status. Okay, so it can be pending and then eventually approved. And the idea here is that this transaction, let's say the amount is worth 500. Okay, so for this particular transaction, I'd like to record it as a T account entry in the system, which will have two sides, right? Because a T account requires two sides, a debit and a credit, and it should always be balanced. So in this case, I might have something like for the debit side and for the credit side, that would be debit 500 from the accounting code, let's say, okay, it wouldn't be cash. Let's say food and drinks. Okay, so let's say I have an asset for food and drinks. Okay, so this would be debited with 500, and then since I spent cash, it would be credited as 500. Okay, so this one is an expense, right? This one is an expense, while this one is an asset. Okay, so it belongs to the assets category. Okay, so that's the whole idea for the T account. So this would be my T account. Right, I have the accounting code and the corresponding amount and whether it falls under debit or credit. We can have more complex T accounts. For example, if I pay cash in half and then I have, let's say, just for example, some credit points, which can also be considered an asset. for 250. So this is still valid because the debit side 500 is still equal with the credit side, which is also 500. Okay, so how would I model this particular transaction? Well, the way I see it, and the way I used to do it in the previous project, in my previous projects involving some form of accounting system, is that for this entire thing, we can model it under a single model, which we call the accounting entry, because it's a TAccount entry, where in that table we'll have a date, a particular, a status, and an amount. And then for the actual corresponding entries within the accounting entry, we refer to these as the journal entries. Okay, so this one is a journal entry, this one is also a journal entry, and this one is a journal entry as well. Okay, but for this entire thing, this would be, okay, just contextualize it. For this entire thing, this would be an accounting entry. Okay. So given this this concept, the way I model a TAccount is that I have an accounting entry, my primary model, and it has a relation to a journal entry with a one-to-many relationship, meaning a single accounting entry may have multiple journal entries within it. Now, the journal entry itself will have an association to our accounting code, which we already have in our system, at least for the model. So we can say that a journal entry would belong to an accounting code according to the Rails terminology. Okay, so now that we have the concept in place, I guess it's time to implement the models first. Okay, so go ahead and create a model called accounting entry with the fields. I'll just have this, I'll have two dates for this. Since I have a status for pending and approved, I'd like to also have something like date posted, wherein the date posted will be the date when this particular accounting entry was approved. Okay, so I'll have two dates. I'll have date prepared, which is a date value, a date posted, which is also a date value, a particular, which is just text, and status, which is a string for now, so it can be either pending or approved. I won't need an amount because the amount will be defined by the journal entries. And do I have everything? Okay, one more thing about the accounting entry is that every accounting entry can be further categorized under I keep forgetting what it's called. I believe in accounting it's called a book, right? For example, for all transactions related to cash receipts, that accounting entry will be recorded under the cash receipts books, or for any general entry, it can be recorded under the general journal, or the journal voucher books. And some other companies might have various books, but the idea is, at least conceptually, an accounting entry will belong to a particular book. Okay, so for now, I'll have that book as a string, and we can just select it from a set of values the same way we did with the accounting code, where in the accounting code it can belong to a particular category, which is simply defined by a string. Okay, so that's my initial model. Let's go ahead and migrate it. Okay, so it should now be in the schema, accounting entries. Okay, and you can now go to the model. Okay, just keep the schema here, so I have a guide for the necessary fields that I'd like to validate. So we can say validates date prepared. It should always be here. So we say presence is true, validates date posted. Well, the presence for date posted should be true only if the status is considered to be approved. Okay, so in this case, we don't need it present yet. we always need a particular, and then we always need a status. Presence is true as well. And let's say we only have two statuses, only two possible values for statuses. That would be pending and approved. Okay, so we have inclusion and statuses. For book, you can have a bunch of books. Possible book values would probably be something like general journal. Okay, so that's one book, and probably cash receipts, which is another book. Okay, so we'll probably have to refactor this in the future, but for now I have a column that will be able to store the actual book. Okay, now that I have the accounting entry, probably code in the next model, which is the journal entry. Okay, so the journal entry will have a for each journal entry, it will have a post type if it's either a debit or a credit type of journal entry. So for example, food and drinks for this particular accounting entry will be a debit, a debit transaction for this journal entry. But for cash and credit points, it will be a credit entry. Okay, so that would be post type string. Of course, we need the amount. Have it as a decimal. And then we'll have the post type. Oh, of course, we have the accounting code. Now, since the accounting code is a reference to the other accounting code model, we can say accounting code references. Because this will automatically create a foreign key for us. And another reference that we need will be that the journal entry will belong to a particular accounting entry. So we already have that model, and we say now accounting entry references. Okay, let's just check out the migration file first. Okay, so it references accounting code and accounting entry. Accordingly, foreign key is true, so we can go ahead and set up the the model also includes the belongs to for accounting code and accounting entry. So we also have to establish the relationship for the other model. So starting off with accounting entry, we can say that the accounting entry has many journal entries. The same way the accounting code, since it's related to a journal entry, will also have many or has many journal entries. Okay, so in order to establish that relationship between journal entry, accounting code, as well as the accounting entry. So we also need to have amount to always be present, and it should be numerical. For the post type as well, it should be true, and it should only take in the values for the following. So the post types will either be a debit or a credit. Inclusion and post types. Right, so I think that's okay for our model. Okay, we won't be validating this yet. We'll see how we can validate this later on, but I don't think we can validate it straightforward via the model. Okay, so right. So I guess this journal entry and accounting entry will do for now, at least for the initial models. Okay, so I guess it's time to code in the UI, and I believe the way I did this before is that I wouldn't be able to use plain old simple form for this, unlike the accounting code CRUD module, because we're dealing now with a set of transactions. So I'd like to have the module that deals with creating accounting entries to be able to include journal entries, not via a simple form, but rather probably via some other process wherein I select first an accounting code, input an amount, and then input the post type if it's either debit or credit, and it will automatically be associated with an accounting entry. And the idea there is that we cannot approve the accounting entry unless it follows or it adheres to the rules wherein, of course, the debit and the credit side are both balanced. Okay, so to do that, I'll start off with the routes first. And I need an index for the accounting entries. So I'll probably say something like get, or if I use resources, okay, I can start with resources. Accounting entries, but I'll only expose the routes for index and show. Okay. Right. Okay, so I only need index and show, because the idea there is that when I create a new accounting entry, by default it won't be balanced yet because first and foremost it won't have any journal entries yet. And I'd like to have all those operations under show, even the posting part under the show page. Alright, let's see how that looks like in terms of implementation. Okay, so I'll have controller for accounting entries. Extends application controller. So we have two methods. Let's just get all accounting entries for now. And for the show part, we'll get a single accounting entry. Find params ID. Okay, let's just say all for this one. Okay, and then let's just set up our index for now. Accounting entries, and let's go ahead and render the partial for the list of accounting entries. So I also use list as similar to with accounting codes, just to have some inner partial for the actual data that's being displayed in the index. Okay, put in a locals, accounting entries, and of course we need list. Okay, let's include this in our nav. Replace codes with accounting entries. Restart the server, see how that looks like. Oops, I failed to migrate. Okay. Whoops, I guess we have an error here. Okay, so the error here says that foreign key constraint cannot be implemented because the reference accounting code ID are incompatible types, because by default the foreign keys are integer values, but we're now using UUIDs as references for primary and foreign keys. So to fix this problem, we'll have to modify the migration file for journal entries. Okay, and then we can explicitly say that the type is a UUID for both accounting code and accounting entry. Now if we try to run Rails DB migrate again. Okay, now that we properly migrated journal entries, let's see what it looks like. accounting entries path. Okay, so I have a typo under my nav, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so this one is simply accounting entries path. All right, so you have accounting codes and accounting entries. Right. Okay, so going to accounting entries, we have our index page there, and let's have a new button. And what I'd like to do is that if I wanted to encode a new accounting entry, the user will have to click this button. So I'll just have a button tag here for new accounting entry. And I'll give it an ID. Button. Okay. Okay, so what I want to do is that every time I click new accounting entry, before it actually creates an accounting entry, I like to input the default values, in particular the date, the particular, as well as the, well, not the amount, as well as the status. Okay. Date prepared as well. By default, it will be the day to day. Okay, so how can we approach that? Well, I like to have a pop-up wherein I click this, and probably a modal or a pop-up will come, will be rendered here, where the user can input the necessary information. Okay, so I'll need a modal for that. Okay, but before that, let me establish the custom JavaScript for this particular page. And we learned last time that we can create packs or individual sort of small JavaScript applications that Webpacker can compile and you can include in your HTML page. So in my case, I'll have a directory called accounting entries under packs. And just to follow the convention, for the index page of accounting entries, it will have its own index.js with the same exact structure, but probably different parameters, such as button new instead of button click. Okay, and this one will be button new. Okay, so it's the same structure as the one we had for the chart of accounts part, or the index page. And right, so similar to our index page right here, I can then copy this and have this as part of the index of our accounting entries module. Okay, but of course, instead of pages, we say accounting entries. So it should compile the index under accounting entries and reference the button new via jQuery. Once it's clicked, we'll just alert something and say button clicked. Try to refresh this. New accounting entry, and we now have button clicked. Okay, so we know that our JavaScript is working. So just to lay down the steps for button new, I'd like to display Modal to input information for that new accounting entry that's to be created. And then on click save, create an accounting entry via API. Okay, so I'll probably provide an API layer, a simple internal API layer that allows us to create an accounting entry, at least for the default values, and then redirect it to the show page. Okay, so redirect to show page. Okay, so let's try this one first. Display Modal to input information. Okay, just look up the Bootstrap Modal. Okay, we might start having multiple modals for our other domains later on. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to create a modals directory specific for a particular domain. Let's say accounting entries, and let's say I have there a partial. Okay, for that modal for new. Okay, so let's just copy some code. So we want that type of modal. Okay, there we go. I think this one will do. Okay, let's just copy paste the entire thing first. Okay, so this is my modal new. You can just remove some of the noise. And I'll give it an ID. I'll call this modal new. Okay, so this one is just a simple title. New accounting entry, for instance. I have the body here, which I'll go back later on. And we have the save button right here. Okay, so we can use the data part, okay, but I'd like to manually control it via JavaScript later on. Okay, so the close works. Let's just have save for this one, and we'll put our input elements within the modal body. Okay, so we have index there, and let's see if we can include the partial, render partial. In this case, accounting entries. Since I'm dealing with a subdirectory here called modals, I'll have to use the path relative to views, modals, and this one will be new. Okay, so it will include this HTML for modal new, and I have to make sure that I reference the modals accordingly in that page's JavaScript. Okay, so accounting entries, I'll now have modal new. In my cache DOM, I'll query it via jQuery. Let's align the equal signs. And we have another button. This one. Oh no, that's already button new. Okay, so you don't have to worry about that. So to display model to input information, we simply call that modal and say modal show, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. Okay, so let's see if this works. Right. Okay, it's not working. Let's see if there's an error. Okay, modal is not defined. $modal is not defined. Okay, so this one should have been modal new because we're referencing the variable modal new, $modal new, which queries the HTML that's or the element with ID modal new. Okay, hopefully no more errors. Modal is not a function. Okay. Modal is not a function. Okay, I might be missing something. I think it's because modal is actually a JavaScript call from the Bootstrap JavaScript library. So it has to work or rather similar to application.js. We'll have to import, right? We'll have to import Bootstrap as well. Okay, I think we can do something like this. Okay, there we go. When you say new accounting entry, it will display the modal for a new accounting entry. I can click close, or I can save the accounting entry. Now, we have another button in our modal, which we call, do you have an ID for it? Okay, no ID yet. So for the save button, let's put an ID there, and it says save button save. It looks something like this, button save. Now, given that, you can refer to it via our custom JavaScript. Save on click, just make sure it's working. Okay, so save button click. Okay, so it's working. Next up would be the input elements needed. Okay, let's design the UI first by HTML. Okay, so we need a date. Form, I forgot which class it was. I think form group or something. It's form group, Bootstrap, form group. Okay, so define a section here, form group. And then let's say we have a label. This one is for the date prepared. We have an input here, which is of type date. Let's just see how that looks like first. Alright, so we have our date input right here. Okay, let's just say by default that the value for this one will be date.today. See if this works. Right, so it works. Okay, so what I did here is that I have the default value date.today for the new modal, and let's put some Bootstrap CSS. Form control. Okay, so it looks something like this. Okay, so the date prepared. And what I usually like to do with my modals is that I like to have a message somewhere here. Right, so I can fill it up with information later on in case something goes wrong. Let's say forgot to add a particular, for instance. Okay, so I'll have to reference that particular element inside my index page. So I can probably call this message and refer to it dot message, since I'm using a class, so that I can actually populate other parts of the page with the message class. Okay. Okay, and then another thing I'll have to do is that for the input part, you have to give it an ID. I'll say input date prepared. Okay, let's put in the other input elements. I actually only need two, I think. Date prepared as well as the particular. In this case, it's just a simple input text and ID particular. Okay, that should be good. This one should be text. Okay, let's just see how that looks like first. Alright, so we have a particular here. Alright, now let's have some UI interaction first. So what I want to do is that if I click the save button, I'll probably put some message here called loading, as well as disable the fields just to make sure that the user, just to show the user that it's actually loading something. At the same time, I'll disable the save button. Okay, disable the save button every time it's clicked so the user doesn't double click it. Okay, so what I do first is I want to extract first actually the values for date prepared. So I don't think I have the reference to those elements yet. So let's just check it out first here. Okay, so we need something like input date prepared as well as input particular, which we still refer to in our cache DOM. Input date prepared is equal to input date prepared, and input particular is equal to input particular. So before disabling these elements, I'd like to get its values first. Okay, so for example, var date prepared is equal to input date prepared dot val. Particular is equal to input particular dot val. And the idea here is that I will be creating, or I'll be submitting this information via API. So I'll have to store this as a payload. So let's say the data payload is actually the following: date prepared is equal to date prepared. Notice how I mix the syntax, since Rails by default, or rather the Rails way, is to define variables using snake case, but in JavaScript, most JavaScript developers refer to the camel case, or prefer the camel case format for naming its variables. Okay, so in any case, particular will be this one. Okay, so just two fields. If you take a look at the accounting entry model, we're actually still missing two things: the status as well as the book. Okay, forgot to include book. So say validates book should always be present, and the inclusion should be from books. Right. Okay, so let's see how we can implement that in our third field, books. It won't be a text actually. I think I could use Rails for this one. I think it's called a select tag. Select tag book. It's got the options. See how it looks like first while this page is loading. Okay, let me just fix my setup before continuing. All right. Okay, page is not loading yet. I think my internet's down. Select book, if I remember correctly. I think it's called options for select, and I include accounting entry, books. Let's see if that works. Okay, no. Okay, all right, so we have something like this. Let's give it a class for form control, as well as an ID for, let's say, input book. Okay, so that all elements for input will be conventionally put prepended with the input text. All right, so I have date prepared, particular, and book. I have to refer it here. So I'll say var input book here. Put it as part of my data, which I'll eventually pass to the API later on. All right. Okay, so now that we have our data, the next thing we might do is we want to disable all the input elements while it's submitting the data. So when we click the button save, the first thing that will be disabled is the actual save button. So we'll have prop, where was it, props? Props, I think, disabled will be true, as well as the other input elements. So input date prepared, props disabled, true. Finally for book. Right, so let's see how this works first. Okay, this site is still not loading. I already figured out the select. Remember the select, so we can actually close that. All right. So if you click save, whoops. Let's see. Props is not a function, so I believe it's just prop with a single s, without any s rather. So props. I can just substitute that. Recompiles again. Okay, so once we click save, then the input elements are disabled, and let's put something in message as well. So we can say something like message.html, and we'll say h5 loading, something like that. New accounting entry, save, and then we have loading right there. All right. Okay, so after that, then we need to interact with an API. So let's say that API is found under the following URL. So let's say we have a URL for create. Let's map this to a URL that looks something like the following. Right? So I'd like to post the data for this URL. Okay, which means in my routes, I'll have to create a namespace for our API and namespace for the API version, starting off with version 1. Okay. And inside version 1, we'll have a post against accounting entries to accounting entries create. Okay, so that's the API layer for this. And just to verify, let's see what the URL looks like. Okay, so for accounting entries, we have a post. We should have a post somewhere. Okay, here we go. API v1 accounting entries post. Okay, so that's working. But it also means that I'll have to point to a controller found in API. Just expand this, found in API v1 accounting entries create. Okay, so it means that I need to have another layer for controller for API v1 accounting entries controller.rb. It's slightly similar to how we construct controllers, but since we're inside a directory API v1, so we have to include it as a module. So module API module v1 before finally defining our class accounting entries controller. extends application controller, and we need to implement the create method. Okay. So just to make sure that these are actually in order, we just raise create method under accounting entries. Let's try that out. Oh, we don't have the JavaScript yet to actually perform the posting. Okay, so I want to post it against URL create. I believe the syntax, and I think I've already done this in the previous videos and starting off this channel. Alright, so what we want to happen is that when we click save, that's new, we need save somewhere here. Okay, so we at least for me, I'm using jQuery in this case. The URL will be URL create, the method will be post, and the data will be data. Now we can provide what this part of the code will do once it receives a successful status, but the same can be said for the errors part. So just keep it simple. Let's have an attribute for the Ajax method as success as well as failure. Okay, so for success, we have a function. Failure, we'll also have a function. So what do you do if you succeed, and what do you do if you fail? In this case, our objective is to be able to post against URL create. Okay. Right. Oh, I don't think it's failure. I think it's error. Okay, so I have to refresh this. Okay, save. We'll go to loading. Okay, do we have an error? Okay, why do we have an error? Oh wait, of course URL create is already there. And let's just, okay, it's getting late, so let's just make sure that we actually release something once it tries to post something to create. Okay, and I think it already did, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, okay. So we can't simply pass a bunch of values to our endpoint because it's not a form, so it doesn't have access to the CSRF authenticity token. So I'd have to pass that. Okay, if I want to keep this as is, I'll have to pass that value together with my data. Okay, so what I can do is I'll have here the CSRF token that Rails seems to be looking for. Okay, I can't remember the name of the actual parameter it looks for. Oh, authenticity token. Now I remember. Okay, so it's not CSRF token. It's actually called authenticity token. Okay, so we have authenticity token. Authenticity token. Okay, now to get the authenticity token, I assume, or we can assume that it's already passed to the JavaScript part. So that would be represented by the options variable. Okay, so what we can do is probably say something like authenticity token is equal to options authenticity token. Okay, so we have to pass it from options, meaning in our index page, okay, we'll have to pass something like authenticity token 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Right, so how do we get the authenticity token? Okay. Okay, we'll first have to query the authenticity token from the meta. What I mean by this is, okay, I know that somewhere here in the head, this one generates this one. Okay, CSRF token, and we want the content. Okay. Okay, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to my other projects and see how I actually did that part. Okay, so why doesn't this have... Okay, let's just look for some other... Okay, let's try to look at some other members. Let's try the members page, or specifically this one. Okay, authenticity token is equal to just a query against the header of the particular document. Okay, so we load it up in our JavaScript. All right. Right, so now we have authenticity token. Hopefully that error goes away. Okay, so new accounting entry. Let's try to post something. It will return loading, but at least, oh, we're still at invalid authenticity token. Why is that so? One more time. Okay, we did throw an exception. Why do we have invalid authenticity token? Okay, we're sure that this spelling is correct. Now let's check out the index page. Okay, let's try to log this in the console and see what actually gets passed. Okay, console is not a function. Console.log rather. Okay, so we can get the authenticity token. So what's wrong? Oh, okay. So we're referring to underscore, but it actually should be the camel cased version since we passed it from our index page this way. Right, we're actually using the camel case version. Pass it as an options for index, and we have our authenticity token. But I want the authenticity token to be a private thing. Okay, so I have the following. Okay, so let's try this again. Let's see if it actually printed out something properly. Okay, so now we have the runtime error, which signifies that we indeed were able to connect our custom JavaScript to our API part. Okay. Okay, so now that we have everything in order, I guess I'll call it a night for now, and probably continue tomorrow to improve the accounting entries part. Alright. Okay, as you can see, we're actually reading the necessary values. Alright. Okay, so I guess that's it for this part. So just to summarize, all I've really done was to create a simple interface to start creating new accounting entries. We have two new models, an accounting entry as well as a journal entry. And the relationship is that an accounting entry can have many journal entries, and that each journal entry will have a post type, debit or credit, of which the entire accounting entry will only be valid if debit and credit sides are balanced in terms of the sum of their values. Okay, so I'll continue this tomorrow, and I guess that's it for now.